Begin the Gemara today on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, 5 lines from the top of the Amud, where it says Amar Avasi. So here the Gemara is continuing the discussion of Tumah and Tara that we had before. This goes back to what it said in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva learns from a pasuk that a kikar, a bread, which is a sheni l'tumah, can become a shlishi l'tumah as well. And he learns it from a pasuk because when it says about the tumah of a sheretz, the sheretz enters into the oven becomes a rishon l'tumah, the bread that's inside the oven becomes a sheni l'tumah, and the pasuk uses the term yitma. Rabbi Akiva says, read it yitama, that bread will now be metama, something else, to become a shlishi l'tumah. That's Rabbi Akiva's source. If so, it comes out that Rabbi Akiva holds that transmission of tumah to a third level is learned from the pasuk, and it applies even by chulin, because the pasuk there is not talking about kachim or truma; it's talking even about chulin, anything. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he says there's no source in this pasuk. He learns it out from a kal v'chaimer. This transmission of tumah to a third level, tashlish l'tumah, he learns it from a kal v'chaimer, and more importantly, according to him, the whole kal v'chaimer only applies to truma. By chulin, tumah is transmitted only until a sheni l'tumah. When it comes to truma, which is a step higher, more level of holiness, so it's a step up, over there, the level of tumah is something they have to be more careful about, and the tumah can be transmitted even to a shlishi l'tumah, only by truma. Now here, the Gemara is going to bring that there's many other Tanaim that held the same, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that this is only by truma. Talk to Gemara, Amar Avasi, Amar Rav. Amar lo Amar Rav ben Isi Amar Rav. Rab Meir, v'Rab Yosi, v'Rab Yeshua, v'Rab Elazar, v'Rab Eliezer. All of these Tanaim, we're on Lamed Amar Aleph. All of these Tanaim, kulu svir lahu, they all are of the same opinion. The ein sheni eisa shlishi b'chulin. There is no idea of transmitting tumah of a sheni l'tumah to a shlishi l'tumah. It's only by truma. And here the Gemara will bring the source of these Tanaim. Where did they say this? Rab Meir says this in the following Mishnah. The Tanan we learned, Kol aton biasmayim midivrei seifrim. All those that have to toivel in a mikveh because they're tamei midrabanan. So Rashi brings a few examples where chachamim were guys at tumah. One of the examples, the Gemara in Bracha says, a person that had mayim shu'uvim, drawn waters, come over most of his body. There was a time where people, after going to the mikveh, would take a shower and then pour drawn water over themselves to clean themselves off from the mikveh. In those times, there was no filters in the mikveh. And people then came to think that this mayim shuvim is actually what makes me tahir. So chacham were guys that know mayim shuvim makes you tameh. It's like this, people will not confuse the mikveh with the mayim shuvim, with the drawn waters. That's one example. Rashi brings other examples. The example of eating a certain amount of something which is tameh, but it's a small size. It's only a chatzi pras, and that makes you tameh only midrabanan. Or the other typical example is the person's hands, netilas yadayim. Person's hands, it has a halacha of tumah, and they all have, all these tumas midrabanan have a status of tumah, and it has a status of being a sheni l'tumah. Okay, so all these people that midrabanan have to toivel, and they have a status of being a sheni l'tumah, metame es hakodesh. It causes tumah for kodesh. So let me again remind you what I mentioned yesterday in the terms of tumah. When the Gemara speaks about this, when it uses the term tumah, it means it's tameh itself, and it could be metama something else. When it uses the term pasul, it means it itself is tameh, and it's not metama something else. So here, this person that's tameh midrabanan, so he's metame es hakodesh, upaisel es hatruma, meaning so he is on the level of a sheni l'tumah. He can cause another two things to be tameh for kachim. That means it can make a shlishi and revi for tumah. But when it comes to truma, so this sheni l'tumah, he will make something else tameh, but only it itself will be tameh. That's called pasul. Only a shlishi l'tumah. That's by truma. But umuter b'chulin ubemaiser. When it comes to chulin and maiser, this person which is a sheni l'tumah, if he touches something which is chulin or even maiser, it won't become tameh. So here you clearly divrei Rab Meir. So you clearly see Rab Meir says when it comes to chulin, the tumah is not transmitted further than a sheni l'tumah. Chachamim oisrim b'maiser. Chachamim argue and they say that no, when it comes to maiser, you're not allowed. This person which is tameh should not touch maiser as well. Similar to what it says benigeh to truma. Okay, so Rashi actually explains that it doesn't mean touch, it means to eat. When it says Chachamim Oisrin b'Maiser, this individual, which is a Sheni L'Tomeh midrabanan, he has the status of Sheni L'Tomeh, he's not supposed to eat Maiser. He's allowed to touch the Maiser, but not eat. Okay, then Rashi clarifies that even though the Gemara before said that it's Rab Meir that says that there's no Shlishi L'Tomeh for Chulin, but really we see that even the Chachamim agree to that as well. And the Gemara before, when it said Rab Meir, it didn't mean only Rab Meir, it means Rab Meir and the Chachamim as well. It's just that because Chachamim are unnamed, so it doesn't say the Chachamim beferish. But Rab Meir and the Chachamim here hold that by Chulin there is no Shlishi L'Tomeh. Rab Yaisi, now where do we know that Rab Yaisi holds that there's no Shlishi L'Tomeh when it comes to Chulin? Ha, the Amara. This is connected to what Rab Yaisi said before on the Gemara on Daf Chav Tes. And the Gemara now explains, because the he say, if it would be true that there is a Shlishi L'Tomeh for Chulin, so then it would come out, Laisei L'Revi Betrumeh, so then there should be a fourth level of Tumeh when it comes to Trumeh, and the Chamishi B'Kodesh, and there should be a fifth level of Tumeh when it comes to Kodesh. The Gemara before, I'm not going to go through this again, Barichis, but just the Kitzer, the point that the Gemara said before on Daf Chav Tes is that there's a Kal V'Chomer. There's a Kal V'Chomer from Tvul Yoim, that's one Kal V'Chomer, and then the Gemara brought another Kal V'Chomer, this is the Kal V'Chomer that Rabbi Yaisi brought from Mechusik Kippurim. And the basis of the Kal V'Chomer was that by a Tvul Yoim is Mutter for Chulin. And from there, the Gemara made a Kal V'Chomer to a Sheni L'Tomeh, which is Asur for Chulin. And therefore the Gemara made a Kal V'Chomer from there to learn out that there is a Shlishi L'Tomeh for Trumeh, or there's a Revi L'Tomeh for Kachim. But now if you're going to say that there's a Shlishi L'Tomeh for Chulin, so then you can make the very same Kal V'Chomer from Tvul Yoim or from Mechusik Kippurim and make that Kal V'Chomer to a Shlishi L'Tomeh and say that Shlishi L'Tomeh is Asur by Chulin, and then from here we can understand that for sure this Shlishi L'Tomeh creates a Revi L'Tomeh for Trumeh and a Chamishi L'Tomeh for Kachim. That's what we would learn out. So it must be that if Rabbi Yaisi said that the Kal V'Chomer teaches us that there's only a Revi L'Tomeh for Kachim and a Shlishi L'Tomeh for Trumeh, so where's Chulin? Chulin is one step down. That's how it works. If again, so if Kachim is going to be a Revi L'Tomeh, Trumeh which is one step down is a Shlishi L'Tomeh, and Chulin, which is one step down, is going to be only a Sheni L'Tomeh. That's what we understand from Rabbi Yaisi's opinion before. So that's the source for Rabbi Yaisi. Rabbi Yeshua, where do we see that Rabbi Yeshua holds that for Chulin there's only a Sheni L'Tomeh? The Tanan, because we learned in the Mishnah. And here the Gemara, this Mishnah has a lot of details to it, and the main place where this is all the details of this Mishnah is explained is in the Gemara in Chulin. Rashi brings the explanation of some of it. I'm not going to explain the whole thing. Rashi himself doesn't go through to explain the whole thing. We're going to try to focus on what's relevant for our sugi here. So the Mishnah begins with over there that Rabbi Eliezer said, "Ha'oichel rishain." If a person eats a tomeh, which is a rishon l'tomeh. So Rashi says it's talking about a person that's eating a food which is only tomeh midrabanan, half a pras. It's not the shear. It's a tomeh. Person eats something which is tomeh, which is only a half a pras. Is a tomeh midrabanan. L'chlal, this entire Mishnah is speaking about tumis midrabanan, gzeiris of tomeh midrabanan. So the person ate a rishon l'tomeh. What happens? Rishon. The person himself becomes tamei, lie on the same level of what he ate. Sheni, if he eats something which is a sheni l'tomeh, sheni, he also becomes on the same level of the sheni l'tomeh. Shlishi, so if he eats a shlishi l'tomeh, so then he becomes also a shlishi l'tomeh. His body becomes on the same level of tomeh as what he ate. This is exciting with the Rabbanan. Rabbi Shua, but Rabbi Shua argues with this, and he says, so oichel rishain. Or ve'oichel sheni, this person that ate a food that's a rishon l'tomeh, or if he ate the food which is sheni l'tomeh, no difference. The same thing. What happens is sheni. The person becomes a sheni l'tomeh. Okay, so what Rabbi Yeshua over here is saying is, let me just go back a second to the first Tana Rabbi Eliezer. He was saying a big chiddush. When a person eats food, he becomes on the same level of tumah as the food that he ate. It usually doesn't work that way. By tumah, the way tumah always works is when one item transmits tumah to another, whether by touch, whether by eating, the second item always becomes a level of tumah, a step down. The Rishon makes something else a Sheni, and the Sheni makes a Shlishi. So the Tanakama held that there's a special Chumrah that Chacham will machmeh that if he eats this tumah, he becomes in the same level. Rabbi Yeshua says that Chumrah is only regarding Sheni L'Tumah. When you eat the Sheni, you become like that Sheni. But that Chumrah does not apply to the Rishon. If you eat the Rishon, then we keep it as it would naturally be. You become a Sheni L'Tumah. And Rashi brings a source over there. The Gemara in Chulin explains that by Sheni L'Tumah, we already find in other places that Chachamim had such a kind of a Chumrah that you become like the Sheni itself. Regarding liquids, we find that kind of a Chumrah, and they applied a similar Chumrah regarding eating a Sheni L'Tumah, but not regarding the Rishon. Shlishi, if he ate a Shlishi L'Tumah, so now the halacha is going to be Sheni, he will also become a Sheni B'Kodesh. And this is only if it's regarding Kachim. Ve'ein Sheni B'Truma. But we're not going to apply this halacha of Sheni regarding Truma. Okay, so again, his body is going to become a Sheni regarding Kachim. What does that mean regarding Kachim? That now, if he touches something, that thing is going to become a Shlishi, and then that thing is going to be metama something else to become a Revi. Right, but not regarding Truma. Regarding Truma, we're not going to apply this kind of a Chumrah. Now the Mishnah there continues. This is all Rabbi Yeshua speaking. When was all this said? B'chulin shenasu altares Truma. This is when a person that's eating the chulin, he accepted upon himself that the level of his tara regarding the chulin should be the same as the level of tara that there is regarding Truma. Then I say over here, this halacha, that you could transmit that there could be a shlishi. What did it say over here? That the person ate a shlishi, and that shlishi makes him into a sheni. So regarding that detail of the shlishi l'tumah, the Braisa clarifies, when is there a shlishi l'tumah? So usually what Rabbi Yeshua is saying is, usually by chulin, there is no shlishi l'tumah. If a person, when does this apply? Rashi says, for example, a kayin. A kayin is very accustomed to eating truma. And by truma, there is a shlishi l'tumah. So he wants to always have that same level of being careful regarding anything he eats. So he accepts upon himself that his chulin should have the same status of tumah, even just like truma. So then, since the chulin is being eaten on the same level as the tara as truma, there can be a concept of shlishi l'tumah, that is, even regarding chulin. But otherwise, usually, there's no concept of shlishi regarding chulin. That's what Rabbi Yossi is saying here. Again, the chulin shenasu al taras hatruma. The concept of shlishi only applies if it's chulin that's being eaten on the same level of tara like truma. So now the Gemara says, what do I see over here in Rabbi Yeshua's opinion? So he's clearly telling me that al taras hatruma in. If he eats his chulin on the level of tara like truma, that's what he accepted upon himself, then the shlishi l'truma applies. But al taras hakodesh loy. This is the gersa we have in our Gemara. So first I'll explain the gersa here in the Gemara. But what happens if a person accepts upon himself that his level of tara for chulin should be just like kachim? There's no such a thing. Rashi says that batla daita, you can't accept such a level of tara b'negeh to chulin that it should be just like kachim. Batla daita ve'im b'dvar of klum. Because the only level that a person could accept and then he'll keep the halachas of tumah on a higher level is like the level of truma. But like the level of kachim, that doesn't exist. People don't usually accept such a thing, and therefore his acceptance doesn't have any validity. Okay, so what the point is, we see that chulin itself has no shlishi l'tumah. Only if he accepts upon himself that the chulin should be like truma, then it'll be a shlishi l'tumah. So that proves that Rabbi Yeshua holds that there's no shlishi l'tumah by chulin. The other gersa Rashi brings over here is that more simple, that the Gemara is saying only if he accepted upon himself that the chulin should be like truma. And Rashi's guide is al taras at in chulin gredi loy. But if it was just plain chulin, then there's no such a thing as a shlishi l'tumah. So the Gemara concludes al mekasavar ein sheni oiser shlishi b'chulin. So Rabbi Yeshua holds there's no shlishi l'tumah when it comes to chulin. The next opinion that it was brought before Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar, where we know that he holds the same. The Tanya we learned in the Braise, or this is really a Mishnah. The Tanan we learned in the Mishnah. Rabbi Lazar says, Shloshton Shavin. When you have three items, whether it's a chulin item, a truma item, or a kachim item, and they both are a rishon l'tumah, so they're both going to be the same. Harishain sheba kodesh v'sheba chulin v'sheba truma. It's an item which is a rishon l'tumah, whether it's regarding kachim, whether this item itself is kachim, whether it's chulin, whether it's truma. So then the halacha is as follows: Mitam mishnayim upaisel echad b'kodesh. Regarding kachim, this rishon l'tumah will cause two things to become tamei. Again, the term tamei always means that it itself is tamei and it's mitam something else. So in other words, it'll be a sheni and a shlishi l'tumah, and then that shlishi paisel echad. Then that shlishi will also make a revi l'tumah. So it goes all the way to revi. That's by kachim. Mitamei echad upaisel echad b'truma. This rishon l'tumah, when it comes to truma, so then it'll cause a sheni l'tumah and a shlishi l'tumah. Then that shlishi l'tumah is pasul. It does not go further than shlishi. That's bit by truma. Upaisel echad b'chulin. And a rishon l'tumah only makes one more item tamei, and it's called paisel because only it itself becomes tamei. It doesn't go any further because it only goes to sheni l'tumah. So we see right over here clearly, Rabbi Elazar said that this idea of Tumah by Chulin only goes until Sheni, not further to Shlishi. The last source over here, the last opinion, was Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer here, and this Mishnah also says this idea that there's a difference between Truma and Chulin. Chulin, the Tumah goes till Sheni, and by Truma it goes until Shlishi. Okay, now this Mishnah actually will be speaking about Chala. Chala has the same status regarding Tumah like Truma. So we're going to be speaking about the challah. There's the challah when you have the dough. Before you separate the dough from the challah, so what's this dough? It's chulin. Then once you separate the challah of it, and over here the separation, the way this Mishnah speaks about it, is not the way we do the separation today. You cut off the challah from the dough, and that's how you separate it. But the separation is just by calling a name. B'dibur. You say, in this dough, I designate challah for the kain. It remains together inside the dough. So then what happens to the dough? It becomes challah. There's challah inside this dough. And like I said, the challah is on the same status of the truma. So therefore, this whole discussion that we're talking about, the sheni and shlishi l'truma, the sheni that applies by chulin and the shlishi that applies by challah, is going to be relevant over here regarding separating the dough, the mitzvah of challah. Okay, that's one introduction. The other point over here is, what is this Mishnah speaking about? It's speaking about a case where the person's dough became tamei. Usually, the Rashi here brings, how much challah do you have to separate? 1/24 of the amount of dough that you have. What happens if it became tamei though? If it became tamei, so then you have to take off half of that amount, 1/48. And the reason is because the kain anyways can't eat it. In the Torah, it doesn't say clearly a shear for challah. Chachamim gave a shear. So if it became tamei and the kain can't eat it anyway, so you take off a 48th of it, half. Then what happens if the person went and was b'mezid metami this dough? So over here, if he was b'mezid metami this dough, we don't want him to be chayten nisker, to gain out of the fact that he was metami this dough, that now he has to give less challah. So therefore, the Tanna Kama there says he's still is going to have to give the same amount, a 24th. Now this Mishnah here brings the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer says not only does he have to give the same amount, he's going to have to make sure to give the kayin challah, which is going to be tahir, that the kayin could eat. You went and you were matami your dough b'mezid, you're going to now have to make sure to give the kayin a tahir challah from dough. How do you do that? The dough is tamei. So you have your batter, or you have your, not batter, you have your dough, which is tamei. You're going to have to bring a tahir dough and take your challah from the tahir dough on this tamei dough. The only thing is, how do you do that? You have two separate doughs, a tahir dough and a tamei dough. And you want to give challah from the tahir dough for the tamei dough. So, and the halacha by challah is, Rashi here brings, it has to be given min hamukif. Min hamukif means that when you take the challah, it has to be not from a distant place. It has to be close, it has to be connected. So you have to take challah from something which is connected to this tamei dough that you have over here. So you're going to have to somehow connect this tahir dough to the tamei dough, and then you can give the challah. So how do you make that connection?
You have to.
If you connect it to become as one, so then it's going to be a problem. It's going to become tamei, right? It could become tamei. Okay, so let's see. The Mishnah here will explain. Rabbi Eliezer says, challah niteles min hatahira ala tmeya. You separate the challah from the tahir dough for the tamei dough. Now, how do you do that? Keitzad shtei isais. You have two doughs over here. Achas tahira, you have the tahir dough, v'achas tmeya, and now you have the tamei dough. So what do? Neitel kedei challah miisa shaloi hor machalasa. You're going to be makayim the mitzvah of challah on this tahir dough for the tamei dough. And the Rabbi Eliezer is clarifying over here, when you're using this tahir dough to give challah for the tameh dough, that has to be of a tahir dough that no challah was separated of it yet. If challah was separated from it, so then it's not even chayiv in the mitzvah of challah anymore. You can't take from it challah. So it has to be, you have to have a tameh dough and a tahir dough, and the tahir dough is also a dough that challah was not separated from it yet. But now they have to be close to each other. They have to be touching each other. So what do? The noisin pachais mekebeya be'emtza. You take a piece of dough, and that piece of dough has to be a small piece that's less of the size of an egg, and you put it in the middle to connect them. Kedei litol min hamokif. So now when you separate the challah from the tahir dough, it's connected by this connector in between. It's less of an egg size that's connecting the two, and that's how you're able to connect the take off the challah. Okay, so
there's no risk of the tumah coming from
the what?
There's no risk that the tameh dough will become tameh on the
No, we're not chayshish for that. So what's the point of it? What are we accomplishing by putting that less of an egg size in between? So Rashi explains that the halacha regarding a food that's less than a kebeya could become tameh, but can't transmit tumah. That's Rashi's shitta here. Okay, so therefore, when you put this egg size in between, this little connector between these two doughs, so that kebeya becomes tameh. So you had this tameh dough, which was a rishon l'tumah, right? Now you have this little kebeya that's in between, it becomes a sheni l'tumah. But that sheni l'tumah, it can't, because it's so small, it can't transmit tumah any further to the tahir dough. And now, you take off the challah from, or you don't have to take it off. I mentioned before that the way what we're talking about here is he calls the name challah in this tahir dough, and as soon as he calls the name challah, he takes away the kebeya. You don't want it anymore to be connected. The moment you call the name challah on this tahir dough, what happens is now this dough its status becomes elevated. Until now, this dough was just chulin. Now, the moment you call challah, it becomes elevated to the status of challah. There's challah inside this dough. And like I said before, challah is on the level of truma. Okay, so the moment you call the challah, you remove that less of kebeya that's there, connecting these two together. But now, as far as we understand now, the point of putting this piece that's less than a kebeya is because it could become tummy, but it can't transmit tumah. So therefore, it won't transmit tumah from the tummy dough to the tahir dough. Okay, now chachamim oisrim. 1 second, we'll see. Now chachamim oisrim. The chachamim say that this is not allowed. You can't do this. You can't put that dough in between, that connector between the tahir dough and the tameh dough. Okay, they disagree to this. The Gemara is going to explain everything, the opinion of Chachamim and the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, V'tanya, in a Braisa, we learned about this whole thing, that you put that piece of dough to connect the tameh dough with the tahir dough, that kibetza. That connector that you're putting to connect the two, it could even be a kibetza. It could even be an excise. Now, simply, what would be the pshat of this? Why could you put even a kibetza? If you're connecting these two doughs with a kibetza is the size that it could become tameh and it could transmit tumah. So why would this kibetza that connect the two not transmit tumah from one to another? So the answer is very simple. Because this dough is a rishon l'tumah. The kibetza becomes a sheni l'tumah. The sheni will not transmit any tumah to the other dough because by chulin there is no shlishi l'tumah. So the kibetza becomes a sheni l'tumah when the dough that it's touching never becomes tameh, because there's no shlishi l'tumah. But what happens the moment you call the name challah inside this dough? At that moment, it gets elevated to become challah, which is like trumah. Now shlishi l'tumah does apply. So the moment you call the name challah, you have to remove that connector. At that very same moment, you have to remove that connector so that it shouldn't become a shlishi l'tumah. That's the simple pshat over here. Okay, so that explains the Braisa. Now, why the Mishnah said that you should put a less than a kebeya, we'll see soon. Rashi explains. Okay, but now the Gemara explains why do Chachamim disagree with this concept? Chachamim said you can't do this. You can't put that connector dough in between. Why not? So the students in yeshiva that were learning this subject, and what they were trying to prove is the point that we said before, that there's only a shlishi for truma, and there's no shlishi for chulin. So they thought as follows: Idi v'idi, both the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer agree that what we're speaking about over here is be'isa rishayna. The dough that's tameh is a rishayn l'tumah. And another thing that they both agree to is the chulin hatvulin l'chala. When you have a dough that's chulin, and the challah was not separated from it yet. That's what tvulin lechallah means. That it is sort of, tvulin could be translated as mixed in, because the challah was not separated of it yet. But before you designate that challah in it, like a challah dam, that dough does not have a status of challah. It's just chulin. Even though you may think, well, there's challah mixed inside of it, I didn't designate it yet. No, it's because you didn't designate it yet, it's totally chulin. Okay, so therefore we have over here a dough that's tahir and it's totally chulin, and we don't consider it to be any challah mixed inside of it. So now, what is the argument over here between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer, whether you could put that connector between the tamei dough and the tahir dough? So my love, don't you think? The argument is this exact point that we were talking about before. The Mars of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is Ein Sheni Eisa Shlishi B'chulin. A Sheni L'tomeh will not cause a Shlishi L'tomeh for what touches it. That's regarding Chulin. So therefore there's no problem to put that connector between the doughs. Why? Because this dough is a Rishon L'tomeh. The connector, even though it's the size of a kibbutz, it becomes a Sheni. It will not cause the other dough to become Tameh, because this other dough is Chulin. And there is no Shlishi L'tomeh for Chulin. But Omar Savar, the Chacham's opinion is Sheni Eisa Shlishi B'chulin, that a Sheni could cause a Shlishi L'tomeh for Chulin, and therefore when you put that kibbutz there, what's going to happen? It's going to cause Tomeh for the other dough, because it will become a Shlishi L'tomeh even though it's Chulin. So right over here we seemingly see this argument, whether there's a Shlishi L'tomeh for Chulin. Okay, so the Gemara here explains the machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer. What Rashi over here adds, that we could also explain the machlokes, or the other version, that is, of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion in the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer's opinion in the Mishnah was, when you put that connector, don't put the connector of the size of a kibbutz, put it in the size of less than a kibbutz. Why would Rabbi Eliezer say it less than a kibbutz? If there's no shlishi l'tomah for chulin, so even if you put a kibbutz, why should it be a problem? So he says, Rashi says that he holds it still, nevertheless, the rule regarding tumah is, as much as we could minimize tumah, you have to minimize. Why make a full kibbutz tumah if you can make less than a kibbutz tumah? It's less tumah. It only becomes tumah, and doesn't have the koyach of transmitting tumah to anything, not even to truma or to anything else. We always have a rule that we have to try to minimize the transmission of tumah. That's one way Rashi explains it. Another thing Rashi says is that over here, what happens? The moment you call the name challah, you have to immediately remove that kibbutz. Because the moment you call the name challah, now a shlishi l'tumah could be transmitted. So Rabbi Eliezer and the Mishnah is afraid that you might not remove it immediately, and therefore it is going to become tameh. So therefore he says that connector that you put there, put it less than a kibbutz. So in case you don't remove it right away, it shouldn't become tameh. That's the explanation for the Mishnah. But again, what's the point over here? That it seems like the machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer is whether you could transmit tumah to a shlishi l'tumah by chulin. So the Gemara says on this, not necessarily is that the explanation of their machlokes. Rav Mari Bereid Rav Kahana explains, no, the Kula Alma, everybody agrees, Ein Sheni Eisa Shlishi B'chulin. Like we said before, most Tanoim say that there's no Shlishi L'tomah by the Chulin. So then what's the machlokes over here between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer, whether you should put that connector in between? But v'hacha, here the argument is in the other point that we brought up before. B'chulin hatvulin l'chala kamiflagi. They're arguing regarding this dough, which is right now chulin, but you did not separate the challah of it yet. What kind of a status does this dough have? Mar Savar, the opinion of the Chachamim is kachala domo. That dough, even though you didn't separate, you didn't designate the challah in it yet, but there's sort of challah mixed inside of it. So therefore it has a status of challah, which is the same status as terumah. So therefore, shlishi l'tomah does apply here. So you can't connect these two doughs with each other with an egg size of a dough, because it's going to become tameh. But Marsa, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is like a challah dami. It's not like challah, it's just chulin, and therefore tumah will not be transmitted to it, because if it's chulin, there's no tumah on a level of a shlishi l'tomah, so there's no problem. That's one shot. Or we could say another idea here. The machlokes between the Chacham and Rabbi Eliezer is based on the following: the Kula Alma, everybody agrees. Chulin atfulin l'chala. When you have chulin, this dough which is chulin, and the challah was not separated or designated in it yet, like a challah dough, it's not challah at all. It's totally chulin. So what should be the problem? Why can't I connect it with this X size of challah in between, or of dough that is in between? And also, everybody agrees, ve'ein sheni oisa shlishi b'chulin. A sheni l'tumah, when it comes to chulin, does not transmit tumah to a shlishi. So then what's the problem according to the Chachamim? But v'hachav, here there's something else. B'muter ligroim tumah l'chulin shebe'eret Yisrael kamiflagi. What they're arguing is it allowed in Eretz Yisrael to go ahead and cause tumah for something which is chulin? Here, so in other words, according to the Chachamim, there was a gzeira in Eretz Yisrael, because there's so much truma in Eretz Yisrael, and there's kayanim, and they have to be so careful with their level of tumah. So Chachamim were geyser in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to cause chulin to become tumah lechatchila. We don't want there to be a lot of food and a lot of things in Eretz Yisrael to be tummy. So that's the machlokes here. Is there such a gzeira? Mar savar muter ligrim tumah lechulin sheberetz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer says that we're not geyser this. That you're allowed to cause tumah for something which is chulin in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the fact that you're placing that kebeya in between and you're causing tumah, a sheni l'tumah for it, is not an issue, as long as it won't transmit the tumah to the other dough. But Amar Savar, the other opinion here is Aser ligraim tumah l'cholim sheberetz Yisrael. The other opinion, which is the Chachamim, they say you're not allowed to cause tumah for chulin in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore you shouldn't do this, even though it wouldn't be a problem, wouldn't actually cause tumah for your tahor dough, but nevertheless we don't want to cause tumah in Eretz Yisrael for something that's not necessary. Okay, so to the connector itself. That connector itself, you're causing it to become tummy. According to this pshat here, Rashi says, we can say now another pshat in why Rabbi Eliezer and the Mishnah says that connector should be smaller, less of the size. It should be less of a kebeya, because Rabbi Eliezer and the Mishnah agree to the premise of the Chachamim, that we don't want to cause extra tumah in Eretz Yisrael. So if you could connect it with less than the kebeya, why put a kebeya to cause extra tumah rather, that is in Eretz Yisrael? That explains Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Chachamim go a step further. Chachamim say we don't want to cause any extra tumah whatsoever, and he's going to have to separate his challah from the tummy dough itself without connecting it to any tahor dough at all. Okay. Now we go back to the Mishnah in the beginning of the Perek. This is Bay Bayayim. As Rashi said, this was that day over there when they opened the Bismadrash for everyone to come in and learn. On that day, there were many different halachas that were explained and settled. So Bay Bayayim, Darish Rabbi Akiva v'chulu. What did he darshan? He darshan regarding the cities of the Levium. That the pasuk says in one place that there was 1,000 amas around that was left empty. Another pasuk said that it was 2,000. What did Rabbi Akiva say? That it refers to the Tchum Shabbos. The Tchum Shabbos out of the city is 2,000. But then there was another opinion. Rabbi Eliezer and the Mishnah said it doesn't mean 2,000 amas. It means that there was 1,000 that was left empty, and then there was another 1,000 that was planted with beautiful vineyards and the Sotahs and so on. So the Gemara explains, "B'mai kamiflagi." What are Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer arguing about? Marsava, Rabbi Akiva's opinion is, and you have this throughout Shas, it's quoted many times, Tchumin da Iraisa, the Isser of walking out of the Tchum Shabbos, 2,000 Amas, is Asr min HaTeireh. And we see it over here in the Teireh regarding the cities of the Levium. The 2,000 Amas is the Tchum. Marsava, but the other opinion is, no, the Rabbanon. Tchum Shabbos, it's all Gzeirim with the Rabbanon. Min HaTeireh, there is no Tchum Shabbos of 2,000 Amas. And therefore he darshans the pasuk that it's talking about something else. It's talking about the vineyards and the fields that were planted outside the cities of the Levium. Weiter, the next thing it said in the Mishnah was regarding how the Oz Yosher was said when the Yidden said the Shira. Did Moshe Rabbeinu say it first, and did the Yidden respond after him? Or did the Yidden all say it together? So here the Braisa brings actually 3 opinions about this, and brings the sources and the psukim by the Shira, how the Shira was said. Tana Rabbanu learned in the Braisa, Boy Bayayim Darish Rabbi Akiva, on that day Rabbi Akiva darshan. B'shah Shal Yisrael min hayam, when Yidden came out of the Yam Suf, Nosnu Einayim Loy Mashira. They looked with their eyes and they saw the great miracles, and they were inspired to sing to the Eibishter. The Kates Adam Rishira, how did they sing to the Eibishter? So the first opinion here is Kegodel, like Rabbi Akiva, Kegodel HaMakres HaHalal. Like a Godel that's reading the Hallel and everyone responds after him. And how do they respond? They only respond after him, Rashi Prokim. So this is a Gemara in Sukkah that speaks about Hallel, when you have one person that's saying the Hallel and nobody else is able to say the Hallel, and they want to be Yaitse with his Hallel. How are they Yaitse with his Hallel? He says the whole Hallel, and everyone else, after the Chazan finishes every paragraph, they respond Hallelujah. Hallel begins with Hallelujah, so that very beginning of Hallelujah, you always respond Hallelujah. That's how the Hallel is said. So the same thing over here. What happened? Moshe Amar Ashira Lashem. Moshe began. What's the first thing that they sang when they said the Shira? They began Ashira Lashem. So and V'heinoim and Ashira Lashem. The Yidden responded Ashira Lashem. Moshe Amar Kigoy Ga. Then Moshe sang and said the next praise for the Eibishter Kigoy Ga. But V'heinoim they responded. Yidden responded Ashira Lashem. Just like by Hallel, you always respond Hallelujah. So over here, the first praise is Ashir el Hashem. Yidden always responded Ashir el Hashem, but Moshe Rabbeinu was really the one that said the entire Shira. That's Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yosef Liliyai me cotton hamakres Hallel. That the way Yidden said Hallel is like a cotton that says the Hallel. How does a cotton say Hallel? So there in the Gemara in Sukkot it says if the only one that knows the Hallel is a cotton can't be mitzi anybody. He's not chayiv in mitzvahs. He can't be mitzi anybody with the Hallel. So if you're going to want to say Hallel after a cotton, you're going to have to repeat after the cotton everything that he says. So therefore, over here it's the same thing happened. They would answer everything that Moshe Rabbeinu said. Kol mashu oimer. Moshe Amar Ashir el Hashem, and Moshe Rabbeinu says Ashir el Hashem, V'heinoim Ashir el Hashem. Yidden respond after Moshe Rabbeinu and also say Ashir el Hashem. Moshe Amar Kigoy Ga, V'heinoim Kigoy Ga. Yidden also respond the same, and Yidden said the entire Shira. They just responded after Moshe Rabbeinu. Rab Nechemia says, Keseifer ha'peiris al Shema beveis hakneses. Like a sefer, this is a sefer means a teacher, and the only reason it's saying the example of a teacher is because he's usually in the Bismedrish with the children, so it's using this example. But it means like a chazan, which is in the shul, and he's peiris al Shema beveis hakneses. What does peiris al Shema mean? Peiris means like he begins. That's the pshat of the here peiris. He begins saying the brachas by Kriya Shema, and after he begins, everyone follows after him and says everything on their own. That's the peiris al Shema in Beis HaKnesses. Shehu peisayach tchila, he begins, and then everyone comes and follows after him. So over here the same thing. Moshe Rabbeinu began saying the Shira, but right after Moshe Rabbeinu began, all Yidden said it together. There was Ruach HaKodesh and they all said it together. That's the three opinions of here how the Shira was said. Now, b'maika miflagi, what's the source of their argument? Rabbi Kiva's opinion is that when it says in the pasuk leimar, that word leimar is an extra word. What does it mean? Amilsa kamaisa. Leimar means Yidden responded. And that means on the beginning. It goes on the Ashir el Hashem. The Yidden responded Ashir el Hashem, but they did not say the entire Ashir themselves. Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yosef leimar akol milsa. Leimar means they responded after Moshe Rabbeinu, but they did say the entire Shira. They responded all the words of the Shira. Rab Nechemia says after leimar it says vayomru leimar. What does vayomru mean? The omer kulu bahati hadodi. The vayomru means in plural term all Yidden said it together. When it says leimar, what does it mean leimar? The Yidden followed after Moshe Rabbeinu. They responded. The pasach Moshe Bereisha. That Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that opened up. He began, and then all Yidden said afterwards in unison, all as one. Tana Rabbana regarding the Shira, we learned another, but I said, Darish Rabbi Yisai Glili, B'shash All Yisrael Min HaYam. When Yidden came out of the Yam, Nosna and named Lema Shira, they saw what happened and they wanted to say Shira. V'keit said Omru Shira, how did they say Shira? Oilul Mutlal Birke Imai, an infant is sitting on his mother's lap, and V'tinik Yainik Mishtei Imai, and a baby is nursing from the mother. Kivin Shiro, Sashchina, the little baby saw the Eibishter. So Oilul Higbiat Savari, this little infant lifted up his neck, and V'tinik Shamadad Mipiv, and the baby went away pulled out his mouth from his mother, and they saw and they began singing. Va'amru, and they said, Zeh Keli Vanvei. This is our God, and I will sing to the Eibishter. And we see Shanama, the pasuk says, Mipi Eilim v'Yankim Yisadet ha'Eis. From the little babies, the infants, you've established the strength of the Eibishter, and this refers to the time of the Shira. Rab Meir said, Minayin shafilu ubrim shebimei iman. That even the fetuses in their mother's womb, Amru Shira, they sang as well. Shanama, because the pasuk says, Bima Keles, when Yidden were gathered together by the Yam Sof, Baruchu Elikim, they sang to the Eibishter, Mimekar Yisrael. What does Mimekar Yisrael mean? Even those that are in their source, in their mother's womb, in the mother's stomach. On this, we have here in the parentheses, but the question is, V'holei Chozu, if they're in their mother's womb, they didn't see the revelation of the Shekhinah. Rav Tanchum says, Keres nasalenkas paklaria mirivero. Their mother's stomach became like glass, and they saw through it, and they saw the Shekhinah, and they began singing as well. So just one point here, the Rebbe says on this piece of Gemara, there's a long sikha about this, Chelik Laman Aleph, and Parshas B'Shalach, the first sikha, big arichas, the Rebbe goes through this whole Gemara, and the Rebbe says, you see over here that the Shira was said with a achtos. From the greatest of Yidden, Moshe Rabbeinu, to the little babies, even the fetuses in their mother's womb. This tremendous achtos could only be caused by the Nasi Adar, by Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's why, according to all opinions, Moshe Rabbeinu begins. Only Moshe Rabbeinu can bring in such a kind of achdus. But then there's various opinions in how that achdus comes down through into Klal Yisrael. To what extent that achdus connects to the level of Yidden. Is it all Moshe Rabbeinu? Rabbi Kiva says it was all Moshe Rabbeinu. Yidden just responded as Shir Hashem. Yidden did not say the Shir, because this level of Achdus is coming, the Yechidish Benefesh, it comes from Moshe. And the other Tanaim say, no, the Achdus permeated their existence more b'pnimius to various degrees, and therefore even they were able to say Shir themselves. So Rabbi goes through all these levels about Ichas Gedayla explaining this Indian here.